The wind howled through the dead pines like a mourning widow, carrying with it the red dust that had settled over everything in this forsaken corner of the frontier. Clara Whitmore stood at the window of her weathered cabin, watching the horizon blur into a rust-colored haze. The glass pane, one of only two that remained uncracked, rattled in its frame with each gust. She pressed her palm against it, feeling the cold seep through, matching the numbness that had taken residence in her chest these past 8 months. 8 months since Thomas and little Samuel had been taken from her in that terrible accident. 8 months of waking to an empty bed and a silent house. 8 months of the townspeople's whispered prayers and pitying glances that cut deeper than any blade. The cabin groaned around her, its timbers protesting against the approaching winter. Thomas had built it with his own hands when they'd first arrived in this desolate stretch of land, full of dreams about taming the wilderness and raising a family. Now it stood as a monument to broken promises, its roof sagging where the support beam had begun to rot, patches of daylight showing through gaps in the shingles. Clara pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned from the window. The main room was sparse, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. She couldn't bring herself to remove Thomas's chair. A stone fireplace that struggled to keep the cold at bay, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. The smaller room, where Samuel's crib had stood, remained closed. She hadn't entered it since the day she'd packed away his few belongings. Outside, thunder rumbled across the plains, promising the first real storm of the season. Clara knew she should check the roof again, perhaps move the water buckets to catch the worst of the leaks, but exhaustion weighed her down like iron chains. She had managed alone these months through sheer necessity, but each day grew harder as winter approached. The storm arrived with violent fury just after nightfall. Rain hammered against the cabin like fists, and the wind screamed through every gap in the walls. Clara huddled near the dying fire, listening to the steady drip, drip, drip of water finding its way through the compromised roof. She'd positioned every pot and bucket she owned beneath the worst leaks, but new ones appeared with each flash of lightning. A sudden crack of thunder made her jump, followed immediately by the sound of splintering wood. A section of roof beam crashed down in the corner, bringing with it a torrent of rain and debris. Clara scrambled back, her heart pounding as she watched helplessly. The storm had found the cabin's weakness and was determined to exploit it. She was struggling to move her few pieces of furniture away from the growing puddle when she heard it. 3 deliberate knocks on her door, barely audible above the storm's rage. Clara froze. No one came out here, especially not in weather like this. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the townfolk had long since given up their charitable visits. The knocks came again, more insistent this time. Clara grabbed the shotgun from beside the fireplace, Thomas's gun, which she'd barely touched since his death. Her hands trembled as she approached the door. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to inject authority into her voice. "Name's Will Camden, ma'am," came the reply, deep and steady despite the storm. "My horse threw a shoe about a mile back. I saw your light, just looking for shelter from the storm." Clara hesitated. Travelers weren't uncommon on the frontier, but a woman alone had reason to be cautious. Still, only a fool or a desperate man would be out in this weather. She cracked the door open, keeping the shotgun ready. The man standing on her threshold was tall and lean, water streaming from the brim of his hat. In the intermittent lightning, she could make out weathered features, a face carved by sun and wind. His clothes marked him as a cowboy, worn leather chaps, a long duster dark with rain, but it was his eyes that made her lower the gun slightly. They held a weariness, a kind of quiet sorrow that recognized its reflection in her own. "I don't mean any trouble, ma'am," he said, water dripping steadily from his coat. "I can bed down in your barn if you got one. Just need to wait out the worst of this." Another section of ceiling chose that moment to give way, sending a cascade of water across the floor. Clara jumped back, and the stranger's eyes tracked the damage, taking in the strategic placement of buckets, the sagging beams, the general air of deterioration. "Looks like you got troubles of your own," he observed quietly. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment mixing with desperation. "The barn's in worse shape than the house," she admitted. "Lost half of it in a storm last month." They stood there for a moment, the storm raging around them, two strangers sizing each other up. Finally, Clara stepped back, opening the door wider. "You can come in," she said, trying to sound firm. "But that gun stays by the door, and you keep your distance." "Yes, ma'am." He removed his hat as he entered, shaking the water from it before hanging it on the peg by the door. He moved with a careful grace, mindful not to crowd her space. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 35, with premature silver threading through dark hair. Will Camden stood dripping in her entry, taking in the chaos of the leaking roof with a practiced eye. Without being asked, he began helping her move the remaining furniture away from the worst of the water. They worked in silence except for the storm's symphony and the steady percussion of water on wood. "This beam's about to go," he said finally, pointing to a spot near the window. "And that whole section there is rotted through. You'll lose half your roof before winter's done." Clara knew he was right. She'd known for months, but had pushed the knowledge away like she did most things these days. "I'm aware," she said stiffly. He studied her for a moment, this woman with hollow cheeks and proud shoulders, defending a cabin that was literally falling down around her. "I could help," he offered. "Fix it. I mean, I've done my share of building, in exchange for a few meals and a dry place to sleep. Your barn, if it's got any roof left." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She'd accepted too much pity already, endured too many well-meaning visits from church ladies bearing casseroles and condolences. But this was different. This was an exchange. Work for food and shelter, and the alternative was facing winter with half a roof. "I can't pay you," she said. "Didn't ask for pay, just meals and shelter till the work's done." She considered him again, his steady gaze, the capable hands, the way he'd entered her space without making her feel threatened. "All right," she heard herself say, "but you sleep in the barn, what's left of it, and you'll take your meals outside when weather permits." "Fair enough, ma'am." They spent the rest of the night in a strange but not uncomfortable silence, working together to minimize the storm damage. Will proved himself useful, rigging a temporary patch with some canvas he found in her meager supplies. By the time the worst of the storm had passed, they'd managed to contain the flooding to one corner of the cabin. As dawn broke gray and watery through the clouds, Clara found herself making coffee for two for the first time in 8 months. Will sat at Thomas's chair she'd told him to, practically insisted, though it had made her chest tight to see another man in that spot. "I'll need to get to town for supplies," he said, warming his hands on the tin cup. "Lumber, nails, tar paper. I can make a list if you tell me what you can spare for it." Clara stared into her own cup, calculating what little money she had hidden in the flour tin. $20, she said finally. "That's all I can spare." He nodded like $20 was plenty, though they both knew it wasn't. "I'll make it work. Always do." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Why offer to help a stranger? Will was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the lightening sky. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be alone with more burden than a body can carry." He stood, setting his cup down gently. "I'll have a look at that barn now. See what can be salvaged." Clara watched him go, this strange man who'd blown in with the storm. She should have been more cautious, should have sent him away. The townspeople already whispered about her, the young widow with the cloud of misfortune hanging over her head. First Thomas, crushed when the freight wagon overturned in that flash flood. Then little Samuel taken by fever just a week later, as if God himself had marked her for suffering. But something in Will Camden's quiet manner, the way he'd worked beside her without question or judgment, made her think that perhaps she could bear his presence for a few days, just until the roof was fixed, just until winter's worst was kept at bay. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting long shadows across the muddy ground. Clara allowed herself to hope, just for a moment, that maybe her cabin could be saved. She pushed away the deeper thought that maybe, just maybe, something else could be salvaged too. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered ground as Will Camden worked atop Clara's roof, his movements methodical and sure. He'd been at it since dawn, stripping away rotted boards and assessing the damage with the eye of someone who'd built and repaired his share of structures across the frontier. Below, Clara could hear the steady rhythm of his hammer, occasionally punctuated by the screech of nails being pulled from stubborn wood. She found herself stealing glances through the window as she went about her morning chores. He worked with an economy of movement that spoke of years of hard labor, never rushing but never idle. When he paused to wipe sweat from his brow despite the cool air, she noticed how his shoulders moved beneath the worn flannel shirt, how his hands, scarred and capable, handled the tools with unconscious expertise. It had been 3 days since the storm, and in that time, Will had transformed from stranger to familiar presence. He kept his word about maintaining distance, taking his meals on the porch when weather allowed, retiring to the partially repaired barn each evening. But his quiet industry had already begun to change the atmosphere around the homestead. The roof no longer leaked. New boards replaced the rotted ones, and he'd even mended the fence around her vegetable garden without being asked. Clara stepped outside with a cup of coffee and some biscuits, setting them on the porch rail. "Mr. Camden," she called up, "you should take a break." He descended the ladder with the same unhurried grace that marked all his movements. "Much obliged, ma'am." He accepted the coffee gratefully, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. She pulled back as if burned, and he pretended not to notice. They stood in awkward silence, him on the ground, her on the porch, the proper distance of strangers maintained. But Clara found herself wanting to speak, to fill the quiet with something other than the echo of her own thoughts. "You've done more in 3 days than I managed in 8 months, she said finally. "Sometimes it takes a fresh eye to see what needs doing." He sipped the coffee, looking out over the barren landscape. "This is good land. Your husband chose well." The mention of Thomas made her stiffen, but surprisingly, the pain felt muted, like an old bruise rather than an open wound. "He thought so, said we'd make something of it, given time. Time has a way of changing plans," Will said quietly, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There were lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with sun damage, a tightness to his jaw that spoke of teeth clenched against old pain. "You speak from experience," she observed, surprising herself with the directness. He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "We all carry our losses, Mrs. Whitmore. Some are just better at hiding them than others." Before she could respond, he drained his cup and headed back up the ladder, effectively ending the conversation. But his words lingered in the air between them like morning mist. That afternoon, Clara ventured into the barn where Will had made his temporary quarters. She told herself she was just checking on the milk cow, but her eyes were drawn to the corner where he'd spread his bedroll. His possessions were few and neat: a leather saddlebag, a rifle propped carefully against the wall, a small wooden box that looked worn smooth from handling. Everything spoke of a man used to traveling light, ready to move on at a moment's notice. She was turning to leave when she noticed dark stains on some rags near his bedroll. Blood, fresh enough to still be damp. Clara's breath caught as she remembered watching him work, the way he'd favored his left hand slightly, kept it turned away from her view. That evening, when he came down from the roof, she was waiting with a basin of hot water and her medicine box. "Your hand," she said, not making it a question. "It's nothing, ma'am, just a scrape from a nail. Rusty nails can turn septic. Sit." She pointed to the porch step, using the same tone she'd once used with Samuel when he was being stubborn about bedtime. The memory stabbed at her, but she pushed through it. Will hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the reversal of their roles, but something in her expression must have convinced him. He sat, extending his left hand reluctantly. The gash across his palm was deep and angry-looking, clearly a day or two old. You should have said something, she murmured, cleaning the wound with a gentle efficiency. This close. She could smell wood shavings and leather, the honest scent of hard work. His hand was warm in hers, calloused but gentle, and she found herself taking longer than necessary with the bandaging. Didn't want to trouble you, he said, his voice lower than usual. You've got enough to worry about. Mr. Camden, she said, tying off the bandage with perhaps more force than necessary. If you're going to injure yourself fixing my roof, the least you can do is let me tend to it. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Yes, ma'am. As the days passed, they fell into an unexpected rhythm. Will worked on the house, not just the roof now, but loose floorboards, drafty windows, a door that wouldn't close properly. Clara found herself cooking with more care, making sure there was enough for hearty portions, even baking bread for the first time since Thomas died. The house began to smell like life again instead of grief. One afternoon, Will appeared at the kitchen door with an armload of firewood, snow dusting his shoulders. Winter had arrived in earnest, but the house was now snug against its assault. Found some good deadfall in that copse to the north, he said, stacking the wood by the stove. Should keep you warm for a while. The future tense caught her attention. You'll be moving on soon. Then, he straightened slowly, not quite meeting her eyes. Roof's done. Windows are sealed. Not much else I can do until spring. Clara felt something twist in her chest, a sensation she didn't want to examine too closely. I see. But that evening, as if the universe had its own opinion on the matter, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows with renewed fury. By morning, snow was falling thick and fast, the kind of storm that could trap a man for days or weeks. Looks like you're stuck with me a bit longer, Will said over breakfast, a wry note in his voice. Seems so, Clara replied, and if she felt relief at the reprieve, she kept it to herself. That night, with the storm howling outside, Clara found herself unable to sleep. She wrapped a quilt around her shoulders and sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers. The house felt different now, still empty of Thomas and Samuel, but no longer quite so hollow. Will's presence, even out in the barn, had changed the quality of the silence. She was lost in thought when she heard it. A cry from the barn, sharp and pained. Without thinking, she grabbed Thomas's coat from the peg and plunged out into the storm. The wind tried to tear the barn door from her hands, but she managed to slip inside, calling out, Mr. Camden, Will! She found him tangled in his bedroll, clearly in the grip of a nightmare. His face was contorted with anguish, and he was muttering something she couldn't make out over the wind. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, hesitating only a moment before placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Will, wake up. You're dreaming. His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. For a moment he didn't seem to see her, lost in whatever horror had gripped him. Then recognition dawned, followed quickly by embarrassment. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to— Hush, she said, surprising them both. We all have our demons that visit in the night. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his disheveled hair. In the dim light filtering through the barn slats, she could see the sheen of sweat on his face despite the cold. Haven't had one that bad in a while, he admitted quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the storm creating a strange intimacy in the darkness. Finally, Clara asked the question that had been building for days. Who did you lose? Will was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with memory. My wife, Sarah. She was Apache. He paused, seeming to gather himself. I was cavalry then, stationed at Fort Buchanan. Met her when her band came to trade. Knew it was foolish, a soldier and an Apache woman. But, he shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its helplessness. What happened? Clara asked softly. Though she could guess, the frontier was rarely kind to those who crossed its invisible lines. There was a skirmish. Misunderstanding over some stolen cattle. Her brother was killed, and the band blamed me, said I'd betrayed them, and my own regiment. He trailed off, jaw tight. They found her by the river 3 days later. Never knew which side did it. Doesn't matter. I suppose dead is dead. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She understood now the sorrow she'd recognized in him that first night, the weight he carried in his careful movements and quiet manner. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand, the one she'd bandaged days before. "I'm sorry," she whispered, knowing how inadequate the words were, how many times she'd heard them herself and felt their emptiness. But Will turned his hand in hers, fingers intertwining briefly before he pulled away. "We all carry our ghosts, Mrs. Whitmore. The trick is not letting them bury us." She thought of Thomas, of Samuel, of the closed door to the nursery she still couldn't open. "Some days I'm not sure I'm not already buried," she admitted, the words escaping in the darkness she wouldn't have said in daylight. "You're not," he said with quiet certainty. "Buried people don't make coffee at dawn or tend wounds or venture into storms to wake a fool from his nightmares." A laugh surprised its way out of her, small and rusty but real. "I suppose not." She stood to go, pulling Thomas's coat tighter around her. At the barn door, she paused. "Will, the house is warmer than the barn. There's a cot in the kitchen you could use, just until the storm passes." He was quiet for a moment, understanding the magnitude of the offer. "That's kind of you, ma'am, but I wouldn't want to compromise your reputation." "My reputation." This time her laugh was bitter. "I'm the widow who brought death to her family, Mr. Camden. The women in town cross themselves when they see me. I don't think sharing my kitchen with a hired man could make things worse." "Then I'm obliged to accept," he said formally, but she could hear the gratitude beneath the words. They made their way back to the house through the driving snow. 2 shadows bent against the wind. Inside, Clara showed him the cot in the corner of the kitchen, far enough from her sleeping area to maintain propriety. As she turned to go, he called her name, her given name, for the first time. "Clara!" She stopped, not turning around. "Thank you," she nodded, not trusting her voice, and retreated to her bed. But sleep, when it finally came, was easier than it had been in months. The sound of another person's breathing in the house, a comfort she hadn't known she'd missed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by young Jimmy Patterson, who'd ridden out from town despite the muddy roads. Clara's hands trembled as she recognized the church seal on the envelope. She'd been expecting this, dreading it, but somehow hoping it would never come. Will was out back chopping wood, the steady rhythm of his axe, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat these past weeks. She broke the seal with fumbling fingers, scanning the formal script that spelled out her doom in polite, Christian terms. "Mrs. Whitmore," it began. "The church elders regret to inform you that due to unpaid obligations on the property taxes and mortgage, you must vacate the premises by month's end unless full payment of $127.50 is rendered." The numbers swam before her eyes. $127 might as well have been $1,000. She sank into a chair, the letter crumpling in her grip. Everything Thomas had worked for, the home where Samuel had taken his first steps, would be gone in 3 weeks. She didn't hear Will enter, didn't notice him until he was kneeling beside her chair, his face creased with concern. "Clara, what's wrong?" Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. He read it quickly, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he folded it carefully and set it on the table. "How much do you have saved?" he asked quietly. $23, she whispered, and most of that was meant for winter supplies. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the land that would soon no longer be hers. "This isn't right. You've been paying what you could. The church bought the note when Thomas died. They said they'd be patient, but—" She couldn't finish. But patience had limits. But a widow alone was bad for business. But God's mercy extended only so far. Will turned from the window, a determined set to his shoulders. "We'll figure something out. The barn's old, but the lumber's still good. We could sell it, piece by piece. And there's that bottom land by the creek. Someone might want to lease it for grazing. We. The word slipped out before she could stop it. He met her eyes steadily. You helped me that night in the barn. Let me help you now. Over the next days, they worked with desperate purpose. Will rode to neighboring ranches, negotiating leases and sales with a persistence that surprised her. Clara sorted through their meager possessions. Her few possessions now, she corrected herself, though Will's presence had made the distinction blur. In the evenings, they'd count the slowly growing pile of money, calculating and recalculating. Will had added his own savings to the pot without asking, brushing aside her protests with characteristic stubbornness. It's just money, he'd said. Can always earn more, but it wasn't enough. With a week left, they'd managed to gather only $86. Clara had stopped eating regular meals, the knot in her stomach leaving no room for food. Will noticed. He noticed everything about her now and started placing plates firmly in front of her, standing with arms crossed until she took at least a few bites. One evening, as she pushed food around her plate, he suddenly stood and walked to his corner of the kitchen. From his saddlebag, he withdrew the small wooden box she'd noticed in the barn. He set it on the table between them, his hands resting on the lid as if gathering courage. This was Sarah's, he said quietly. Opening the box, he revealed a silver necklace with turquoise stones, beautifully crafted in Apache tradition. She wore it on our wedding day. Clara's breath caught. Will, no, you can't. It's worth enough, he interrupted. The trader in town, Hoffman. He deals in Indian jewelry. He'd give $50 for it, maybe $60. It's all you have left of her. His fingers traced the smooth stones. I've been carrying this box for 5 years. Clara, 5 years of holding on to something that's already gone. He looked up at her, and the raw honesty in his eyes made her heart stutter. Sarah loved life. She'd hate knowing I kept her memory locked in a box while a good woman lost her home. I can't let you do this, Clara whispered, tears threatening. You're not letting me. I'm choosing to. He closed the box and pushed it across the table. Tomorrow I'll ride to town. We'll have enough. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She rose and found Will sitting by the fire, the wooden box in his hands. Without speaking, she sat beside him on the floor, close enough that their shoulders touched. They watched the flames in silence. Two people who understood loss, sharing a moment of wordless communion. Tell me about her, Clara said finally. Will smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered features. She was tiny, barely came to my shoulder, but fiercer than any soldier I ever served with. First time I saw her, she was breaking a horse that 3 grown men couldn't handle, laughed the whole time, like it was a game. His voice warmed with memory. She taught me her language, showed me how to read the land the way her people did, said I was the worst student she'd ever had, but she married me anyway. Clara found herself smiling too. She sounds wonderful. She was. He turned the box over in his hands. The necklace was her grandmother's. Sarah said it would protect whoever wore it, keep them safe from sorrow. His laugh was hollow. Didn't work out that way. Without thinking, Clara reached for his hand. Maybe it did, in a way. It brought you here. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in the space between them. His free hand came up to touch her face, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Clara. She leaned into his touch, starved for gentleness after so many months of emptiness. But reality crashed back, and she pulled away. We should. It's late. He nodded, understanding and disappointment warring in his expression. You're right. Big day tomorrow. But the next morning brought a new crisis. The milk cow, their one remaining livestock, was down in the barn, breathing labored and eyes glazed with fever. Will knelt beside the animal, his face grim. Lung fever, he diagnosed. Must have caught it from the cold. They spent the day trying to save her, taking turns sitting with the sick animal, applying poultices and trying to get her to drink. But by evening, she was gone. Clara stood looking down at the still form. Another loss in a string that seemed endless. That's $40 we were counting on from selling her, she said numbly. Will put a hand on her shoulder. We'll make it work. Still have the necklace. No. The word came out sharper than she intended. I won't take that from you. There has to be another way. But there wasn't. They both knew it. With 3 days left, they were still short, and Clara could feel the walls closing in. That night, she sat at the table with paper and pen, trying to write to Thomas's sister back east, begging for help she knew wouldn't come in time. Will watched her struggle with the words, then gently took the pen from her hand. Come on, you need air. He led her outside where the moon hung full and bright, turning the barren landscape into something almost beautiful. They walked without direction, feet finding their own path through the familiar terrain. When I lost Sarah, Will said suddenly, I wanted to die, not in a dramatic way, just stop existing. Couldn't see the point in drawing another breath. He paused, looking up at the stars. But the body's stubborn, keeps breathing even when the mind's given up. And one day, you realize you've gone a whole hour without thinking about the pain. Then maybe a whole morning. The guilt of forgetting is almost worse than the grief itself. Clara understood. Oh, how she understood. Sometimes I can't remember Samuel's laugh, she admitted. I lie awake trying to hear it, but it's fading, and I hate myself for letting it. You're not letting it. You're surviving. That's what we do, Clara. We survive, even when survival feels like betrayal. They'd stopped walking, standing close in the moonlight. Clara looked up at him, this man who'd appeared in her doorway like something out of a story, who'd quietly begun putting her broken world back together. I don't want to just survive anymore, she whispered. He cupped her face in his hands, rough palms gentle against her skin. Then don't. When he kissed her, it was like coming home and leaving everything behind all at once. His lips were warm and sure, patient when she trembled, insistent when she responded. She gripped his shirt, anchoring herself in the moment, in the solid reality of him. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Will rested his forehead against hers. I didn't come here looking for this, he said softly. Neither did I. She traced the line of his jaw, marveling at the freedom to touch him. But maybe that's how the best things find us. They walked back slowly, hands linked, neither ready to face the morning and what it would bring. At the porch, Clara turned to him. We're going to lose the house, maybe, but that's just walls and a roof. What matters is what you take with you. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that there could be life beyond this place, but the fear was strong. What if I'm not brave enough? You buried a husband and child and got up the next morning. You've been brave enough all along. That night, Clara made a decision. In the morning, she'd go to town herself, sell what little jewelry she had left. Her wedding ring, the locket with Samuel's hair. It wouldn't be enough to save the house, but maybe enough to start over somewhere new. Maybe with someone new. If she dared hope that far. She fell asleep thinking of Will's kisses, of the wooden box with the turquoise necklace, of the way forward when all paths seemed closed. Outside, the wind sang through the repaired roof, a sound that no longer seemed mournful but almost like a promise. The nightmare came just past midnight, tearing through Clara's sleep like a jagged blade. She was back in that terrible week. Thomas's broken body beneath the overturned wagon, Samuel burning with fever in her arms, his small chest struggling for each breath. But this time, in the cruel logic of dreams, she could save them if she just moved fast enough, if she could just reach. She woke gasping, tears streaming down her face, her hands clutching empty air. The house felt suffocating, the walls pressing in with the weight of memory. Without thinking, she stumbled from her bed, barefoot on the cold floor, her thin nightgown offering little protection against the chill. She made it as far as the kitchen before her legs gave out, grief hitting her like a physical blow. She sank to the floor beside the table, shoulders shaking with sobs she'd held back for months. The strong facade she'd maintained, the careful control, It all crumbled in the darkness. "Clara?" Will's voice came from his corner, thick with sleep but instantly alert. She heard him moving, then felt rather than saw him kneel beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't speak again, just waited while she fought to control the storm inside. "I'm sorry," she managed between sobs. "I didn't mean to wake you." "Don't apologize." His voice was gentle but firm. "Not for this." She looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. In the moonlight from the window, she could see the concern on his face, the careful way he held himself, close enough to offer comfort but not presuming to take liberties. "It was so real," she whispered. "I could hear Samuel calling for me, and I couldn't get to him fast enough, just like before." "Tell me about him," Will said quietly. "Tell me about your boy." It was the last thing she expected, but somehow exactly what she needed. Sitting there on the cold floor, she found herself talking about Samuel, his gap-toothed smile, the way he'd chase chickens around the yard, how he'd curl up in her lap during thunderstorms. Will listened without interrupting, his presence steady as a rock while she poured out memories she'd kept locked away. "He loved morning glories," she said, surprising herself with the random detail. "Called them glory flowers. Thomas built him a little trellis, and we planted seeds together. They bloomed the week after." She couldn't finish. "After they died," Will completed softly. She nodded, fresh tears coming. "I tore them all down. Couldn't bear to see them. Grief makes us do hard things," he said. "Doesn't make them wrong." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Clara became aware of how cold she was, shivering in her thin nightclothes. Will noticed too, rising smoothly to fetch the quilt from his cot, but instead of just handing it to her, he asked, "May I?" She nodded, and he wrapped it carefully around her shoulders, his hands lingering just a moment. The warmth was immediate, but it was his tenderness that undid her. She leaned into him without thinking, and his arms came around her, holding her while she cried out 8 months of suppressed anguish. "I couldn't save them," she said against his chest. "I tried everything, but I couldn't save my baby." "I know," he murmured into her hair. "I know, sweetheart. It wasn't your fault." The endearment, unconscious and sincere, made her cry harder. When had anyone last called her sweetheart? When had anyone held her without wanting something in return? Time passed unmarked. Eventually her tears slowed, leaving her exhausted but strangely cleansed. She became aware that she was practically in Will's lap, his back against the wall, her head on his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong. "I should go back to bed," she said without moving. "Should you?" His hand was stroking her hair, the gesture so soothing she wanted to purr like a cat. "You're still shaking." She was, though now she wasn't sure if it was from cold or the aftermath of grief or something else entirely. "Will, just rest a minute more," he said. "I've got you." Those 3 words broke something open inside her. When was the last time anyone had her? When had she felt safe enough to let go? Even for a moment. She turned her face up to his, seeing in his eyes a reflection of her own longing, her own loneliness. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of feeling again, of wanting things, of forgetting them." His hand came up to cradle her face. "You won't forget them. Love doesn't work that way. The heart just gets bigger, makes room for more." "Is that what this is?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Love?" He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I don't know what else to call it," he said finally. "This feeling like I can breathe again when you're near, like I've been walking in the dark and suddenly there's light." She reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of stubble, the warmth of skin. "I feel it too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." "Me too," he admitted. "But maybe that's how we know it's real." When he kissed her this time, it was different from the sweet kiss in the moonlight. This was deeper, hungrier, full of need and promise and the desperate human desire to connect, to not be alone in the darkness. Clara responded with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. He made a sound low in his throat and gathered her more fully into his lap, the quilt falling away unheeded. She could feel the heat of him through the thin fabric of her nightgown, the strength in his arms, the way his hands trembled slightly as they moved over her back. "Clara," he breathed against her lips. "We should stop. This isn't— You're upset, and I don't want to take advantage." She silenced him with another kiss. "You're not— I need this. I need you." She pulled back to look at him, making sure he understood. "I've been dead for 8 months. Will— help me remember how to be alive." He searched her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. But instead of kissing her again, he stood, lifting her easily in his arms. "Not on the floor," he said. "You deserve better than that." He carried her to her bed, laying her down with infinite care. In the moonlight, she could see the desire in his eyes, but also the concern, the determination to do this right. He sat on the edge of the bed, one hand resting on her waist. "Are you sure?" he asked. "We can stop any time. Just say the word." Instead of answering with words, she pulled him down to her, letting her actions speak. What followed was a revelation, gentle and passionate by turns, a rediscovery of her body's capacity for pleasure, for connection. Will was patient when she tensed, ardent when she responded, whispering endearments that made her feel cherished, desired, alive. Afterward, they lay entwined, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. The room felt different, warmer, fuller, as if their joining had chased away the ghosts that haunted the corners. "I didn't expect this," Clara said softly. "When you knocked on my door that night, I never imagined." "Neither did I," he replied. "Thought I was just looking for shelter from a storm. Turns out I was looking for home." She lifted her head to look at him. "Is that what this is? Home?" "If you'll have me," he said simply. "I know it's soon, and complicated, and folks will talk." She kissed him to stop the words. "Let them talk. They already think the worst of me." "They're fools," he said fiercely. "You're the strongest woman I've known." "I don't feel strong. That's when it counts most, being strong when you feel broken." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Clara, about the house." "No," she said, putting a finger to his lips. "Not tonight. Tonight. Let's just have this." He nodded, pulling her close again. "All right, just this." But even as she drifted toward sleep, feeling safer than she had in months, Clara knew morning would come with all its harsh realities. The house would still be forfeit, the money still short, the future uncertain, yet somehow, lying there in Will's arms, those truths seemed survivable. She thought of Thomas, wondered if he'd understand. He'd wanted her to be happy, had made her promise not to mourn forever if something happened to him. "Life's for living, Clara girl," he'd said. "Don't waste it on the dead. I'm trying. Thomas," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm trying?" Will's arms tightened around her, and she realized he was still awake. "What was that, sweetheart?" "Just making peace with ghosts," she said. He kissed the top of her head. "They're stubborn, ghosts, but I've found they get quieter when you stop fighting them." "Is that what you've done? Stopped fighting?" "Started to, maybe, since I met you." His voice was thoughtful. "Sarah would have liked you. She had a way of seeing straight to the heart of things, just like you do." It should have been strange, lying in bed with a man while talking about their dead spouses, but somehow it felt right. They were who they were because of who they'd loved and lost. To pretend otherwise would be to deny the very experiences that had shaped them. "We're a pair, aren't we?" Clara said with a soft laugh. "Two broken souls trying to make a whole?" "Nothing broken about you," Will said firmly. "Bent, maybe, tested, but not broken. Broken things can't love the way you do." "How do I love?" she asked, curious about his perception. "Fiercely," he said without hesitation. "Completely, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. It's the bravest thing I've ever seen." His words brought fresh tears. But these were different, cleansing rather than devastating. She pressed closer to him, skin to skin, heart to heart, and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be brave enough for whatever came next. Outside, a screech owl called across the prairie, its cry no longer mournful, but simply part of the night's music. Tomorrow would come with all its challenges, but for now, for this precious moment, she was alive and loved and whole. It was enough. It was everything. The blizzard arrived without warning 3 days later, trapping them in the house as surely as if it had locked the doors and thrown away the key. The wind screamed like a living thing, driving snow against the windows with such force that Clara feared the newly repaired panes might shatter. The temperature plummeted until their breath formed clouds even inside. Despite the fire, Will kept constantly fed. "Haven't seen a storm this bad since '73, Will said, peering out through the frost-covered window. The world beyond was nothing but a solid wall of white. "Could last days." Clara stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Since that night, they'd moved around each other with a new awareness, tender but tentative, as if they were learning the steps to a dance neither had expected to perform again. "We have enough food," she said, mentally cataloging their supplies. "Plenty of firewood thanks to you. Water might be an issue if the pump freezes." "Already thought of that." He showed her the buckets he'd filled and placed near the stove. "Should be enough for a few days if we're careful." She smiled at his foresight. "You think of everything." "Not everything," he said, his voice dropping as he turned to face her. "Didn't think about how being trapped here with you might test my gentlemanly resolve." Heat bloomed in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Who says I want you to be gentlemanly?" The hunger that flashed in his eyes made her stomach flutter, but he stepped back, putting careful distance between them. "Clara, the other night. We should talk about what this means." "Must we put words to it?" she asked, though she knew he was right. "Can't we just let it be?" "Not when I'm sleeping under your roof, eating at your table." His jaw was set in that stubborn line she'd come to recognize. "You've lost enough to scandal. I won't add to it." She wanted to argue that she didn't care about scandal, but the truth was more complex. In a small frontier community, reputation mattered. A widow who took up with a drifter would find herself truly ostracized, unable to buy supplies or sell goods. It was unfair, but it was reality. "Then what do you propose?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, watching the storm rage. "When this blows over, I'll ride to the next town, find work, save money. Come spring, if you'll have me, I'll come back and do things proper. Court you the way you deserve. And in the meantime, we pretend that night didn't happen?" "We be careful," he corrected gently. "We remember that some things are worth waiting for." She wanted to rail against the unfairness of it. Hadn't they both waited long enough? Hadn't they paid enough dues to grief and propriety? But she saw the wisdom in his words, even as they chafed. "All right," she agreed. "We'll be careful." The first day passed quietly. They worked on separate tasks, Clara mending clothes while Will repaired a broken chair. But the enforced proximity wore on them. Every accidental touch sparked electricity. Every shared glance held weight. By evening, the tension was nearly unbearable. They ate dinner in relative silence, the storm providing a constant backdrop of sound. When Clara reached for the salt at the same moment Will did, their fingers brushed. Both jerked back as if burned. "This is ridiculous," Clara said, frustration bleeding through. "We're adults, not schoolchildren. Adults who need to make smart choices," Will countered, but his control was clearly fraying too. That night, they retired to their separate spaces. Clara to her bed, Will to his cot in the kitchen. But sleep eluded her. She could hear him moving restlessly, the cot creaking with each shift. The storm outside seemed to echo the turmoil within. The second day dawned with no break in the weather. If anything, the blizzard had intensified. Snow had drifted up to the windows. casting the interior in an eerie twilight, even at midday. The temperature continued to drop until even standing near the stove brought little relief. "We need to conserve wood," Will said, eyeing their dwindling stack. "Might have to close off the bedroom. Just heat the kitchen." Clara nodded, though she knew what that meant, even less space between them. They spent the morning moving her necessities into the main room, pushing her bed against the wall opposite his cot. The arrangement was purely practical, but the intimacy of it set her nerves on edge. By afternoon, a new problem arose. The cold was seeping through every crack, every gap in the walls that Will hadn't been able to fully seal. Clara found herself shivering constantly, unable to get warm, even wrapped in multiple quilts. "Your lips are blue," Will observed, concern overriding his careful distance. "Come here." She moved to where he sat by the stove, and he pulled her down beside him, wrapping his arms around her. "Just for warmth," he said, but his voice was rough. She nodded against his chest, trying to ignore how right it felt to be held by him. His solid presence, his heat, the steady beat of his heart, it all combined to make her feel safer than she had since the storm began. They stayed like that as darkness fell early, neither speaking, both afraid that words might shatter their fragile control. But when bedtime came, Clara found herself reluctant to move to her cold bed across the room. "Will," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice her need without it sounding like invitation. He understood anyway. "It's too cold for proprieties," he said gruffly. "We'll share warmth, nothing more. Survival comes before scandal." They pushed their beds together, piling on every blanket and quilt in the house. Clara lay stiff as a board at first, acutely aware of every inch between them. But as the wind howled and the cold pressed in, she found herself moving closer, seeking his heat. "Just warmth," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. "Just warmth," he agreed, pulling her back against his chest, her head tucked under his chin. But their bodies had other ideas, despite their best intentions. Despite layers of clothing and blankets, the awareness between them was overwhelming. Clara could feel Will's tension in the careful way he held her, the controlled evenness of his breathing. "This was a mistake," he said roughly. "Don't you dare move," she interrupted. "We're adults, remember? We can share a bed for warmth without anything happening." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You have more faith in my willpower than I do. Then I'll have enough faith for both of us." The third day brought no relief from the storm. They woke wrapped around each other, legs tangled, faces close enough to share breath. For a moment, neither moved, caught in the spell of waking warmth. Then reality intruded, and they separated awkwardly. The day stretched endlessly. They tried to maintain normal activities, but the storm had created a world outside of time, a snow globe existence where only the two of them were real. Clara found herself watching Will constantly, the way he moved, the way lamplight caught in his hair, the way his hands gestured when he told stories to pass the time. That evening, something shifted. Maybe it was the wine Clara had found tucked away in the cellar, saved for some special occasion that had never come. Maybe it was the way the storm seemed to isolate them from all consequences. Maybe it was simply that desire, long denied, demanded its due. They were sitting by the stove, passing the wine bottle between them. When Clara finally spoke the thought that had been building all day. "What if spring doesn't come?" she asked. "What if this storm never ends and we're trapped here forever?" "Then I suppose propriety becomes moot," Will said, his eyes dark in the firelight. "Is that the only thing stopping you? Propriety?" He set the wine aside and turned to face her fully. "No, fear stops me too." "Fear of what?" "Of wanting you too much, of not being able to let go when the time comes." His hand came up to cup her cheek, of breaking something that's already fragile. She leaned into his touch. "Maybe I'm tired of being fragile. Maybe I want to be broken and put back together stronger." "Clara." Her name was a warning and a plea. "I know," she said. "I know all the reasons we shouldn't, but Will, We've both learned how suddenly life can end, how quickly everything can be taken away. Don't we deserve whatever happiness we can steal?" He was quiet for a long moment, thumb stroking her cheekbone. "You're making it very hard to be noble." "Good," she said fiercely. "I don't want noble. I want real." When he kissed her, it was with all the pent-up longing of 3 days of careful distance. Clara responded with equal fervor, pouring into the kiss all her frustration, her need, her growing love for this man who'd brought light back into her darkness. This time, when he carried her to bed, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. They came together like the storm outside, wild and necessary and beyond human control. In the circle of warmth they created, the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was only touch and taste and the exquisite relief of barriers finally falling. Afterward, they lay entwined while the blizzard raged on. Clara traced patterns on Will's chest, marveling at the freedom to touch him. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "None," she said firmly. "Whatever comes, this is ours." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her hair. "The storm won't last forever. When it breaks, we'll face what comes." She finished, "Together or apart, but at least we'll have had this." But even as she spoke bravely, Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The storm had given them this stolen time, this pocket of existence outside normal rules. When it ended, reality would intrude with all its harsh demands. The house would still be forfeit. The future would still be uncertain. For now, though, she pushed those thoughts away. Outside, the wind howled its ancient song. Inside, two souls found shelter in each other, building their own small fortress against the storm. Tomorrow could bring what it would. Tonight, they had warmth and wine and each other. In a world that had taken so much, it felt like wealth beyond measure. The blizzard raged on, keeper of their secrets, guardian of their stolen hours. And in the morning, when they woke to silence and pale sunlight streaming through frost-etched windows, they would face whatever came next. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, they were simply two people choosing love over loneliness, connection over careful distance. Tonight, they were home. The morning after the storm broke dawned crystal clear, sunlight glinting off snow that lay 3 feet deep across the prairie. Inside the cabin, Clara woke to find herself alone in bed, the sheets beside her already cool. She could hear Will moving quietly in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of morning routine, coffee brewing, fire being stoked, boots on wooden floor. She dressed quickly, uncertain how to face him after the intimacies they'd shared during the storm. Would he regret it? Would the harsh light of day change everything between them? But when she emerged from behind the curtain, they'd hung for privacy. Will looked up from the stove with such warmth in his eyes that her fears evaporated. "Morning," he said softly. "Coffee's ready." "Morning." She accepted the cup he offered, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "The storm's passed." "It has." He studied her over his own cup. "Clara, about these last few days, please don't say you regret it." She interrupted. "Never." The fervor in his voice made her heart skip. "But it doesn't change the complications. If anything, it makes them worse. Now that I know what it's like to hold you, to—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "I want to do right by you." Before the Clara could respond, they heard horses approaching. Will moved to the window, his body tensing. 3 riders. Looks like the minister and some others from town. Clara's stomach dropped. Of course. The storm had barely passed, and already the vultures were circling. She smoothed her hair, tried to make herself presentable, acutely aware that Will's presence in her home would be obvious to anyone who looked. The knock, when it came, was authoritative. Clara opened the door to find Reverend Matthias Hopkins standing on her porch, flanked by Deacon Bradley and Mr. Garrett from the bank. All 3 men wore expressions of grim disapproval. "Mrs. Whitmore," the Reverend began without preamble, "we've come to discuss your situation." "The deadline isn't for another week," Clara said, lifting her chin. The deadline for the mortgage, perhaps, but there are other matters that require immediate attention. His eyes moved past her to where Will stood by the stove. Mr. Camden, isn't it? The drifter who's been helping with repairs. That's right, Will said evenly. And where exactly have you been sleeping during this storm? Mr. Camden? The implication hung heavy in the air. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, but refused to look away. Mr. Camden has been a perfect gentleman. Has he now? Deacon Bradley's tone was skeptical. A man and woman alone for 3 days. Unchaperoned? You'll forgive us if we have concerns about the propriety of the situation. My propriety is none of your concern. Clara said sharply. I'm afraid it is. Reverend Hopkins said, This community has standards, Mrs. Whitmore, standards that must be upheld. Your husband was a good Christian man. It pains us to see his widow consorting with— Choose your next words carefully, Will said quietly, moving to stand beside Clara. The threat in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. The Reverend's face flushed. I'll speak plainly then. Your presence here, Mr. Camden, is no longer welcome. You'll leave today, or we'll have the sheriff escort you out. On what grounds? Clara demanded. Vagrancy, moral corruption. Take your pick. Mr. Garrett spoke for the first time, his banker's voice cold and calculating. And Mrs. Whitmore, given this unfortunate situation, I'm afraid we can no longer extend the deadline on your mortgage. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. You can't do that. Clara felt Will's hand on her arm, steadying her. I'm afraid we can and will. The bank has a reputation to maintain. We can't be seen supporting impropriety. Get out, Will said, his voice deadly calm. You've delivered your message. Now get off this property. The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly debating whether to press the issue. Finally, Reverend Hopkins nodded. 48 hours, Mrs. Whitmore. I suggest you use them wisely. And Mr. Camden, I expect you to be gone by nightfall. They left in a swirl of righteous indignation and horse hooves on snow. Clara stood frozen in the doorway until Will gently drew her back inside. I'm sorry, she whispered. I've ruined everything. You've ruined nothing. He pulled her into his arms. This isn't on you. If they force you to leave, they can try. His voice was grim. But I'm not going anywhere. Clara, not now. She pulled back to look at him. You can't fight the whole town. Watch me. The determination in his eyes was fierce. I've run from things before. Lost everything that mattered because I didn't fight hard enough. I won't make that mistake again. They spent the morning in frantic activity. Will rode to the neighboring ranches, trying to raise the money they needed, while Clara began the heartbreaking task of deciding what to pack and what to leave behind. Every item had a memory. Thomas's tools, Samuel's tiny clothes she hadn't been able to part with, her mother's china brought carefully across the prairie. Will returned at midday, his face grim. No one will deal with me. Word's already spread. They've closed ranks. Clara sank into a chair, defeat washing over her. Then it's over. No. Will knelt before her, taking her hands. We have options. We could leave together, head west, start fresh somewhere new. With what money? Where would we go? I've got connections in California, ranch work. It wouldn't be easy, but Will— She squeezed his hands, loving him for trying. I can't just run. This is Thomas's land, Samuel's home. Everything I have of them is here. Then we fight, he said simply. But fighting seemed futile against the combined power of the church and bank. As afternoon wore on, Clara found herself standing in Samuel's room, finally able to enter after all these months. It was exactly as she'd left it. The small bed with its quilted cover, the wooden horse Thomas had carved, the sampler she'd been working on with alphabets and angels. She was reaching for the wooden horse when she heard Will's sharp intake of breath behind her. Clara, look at this. He was standing by the window, examining the wall. This board's loose. Together they pried it free, revealing a hidden space behind. Inside was an oilcloth bundle. With trembling fingers, Clara unwrapped it, gasping at what she found. Money, more than she'd ever seen at once, and a letter in Thomas's careful script. "My dearest Clara," she read aloud, voice shaking. "If you're reading this, then something's happened to me. I've been saving every penny I could, hiding it away for you and Samuel. There should be enough here to pay off the land and have some left over. I know you, my stubborn girl. You'll want to do everything yourself, but sometimes it's okay to accept help, even from beyond the grave. Take care of our boy. Live well. Love again. Your devoted husband, Thomas." Clara couldn't continue, tears streaming down her face. Will counted the money quickly. $300, he said in wonder. More than enough. He knew, Clara whispered. Somehow he knew something might happen. "He loved you," Will said simply. "Wanted to protect you even after he was gone." Clara clutched the letter to her chest, overwhelmed by Thomas's foresight and love. Then a thought struck her. But they moved up the deadline. Will they even accept the money now? "They'll accept it," Will said grimly. "They have to. It's a legal debt, and you're offering legal payment. If they refuse, we'll get a lawyer from the county seat." But Clara knew it wouldn't be that simple. The town had turned against her. Even with the mortgage paid, she'd be a pariah. The scarlet woman who'd taken up with a drifter before her husband's grave had settled. "We should go to town now," Will said. "Pay off the mortgage before they can find another excuse." Clara nodded, but first she carefully folded Thomas's letter and tucked it into her bodice, close to her heart. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room. "Thank you for taking care of us one last time." The ride to town was tense. People stared as they passed, women drawing their skirts aside, men muttering behind their hands. Clara held her head high, but inside she felt each slight like a physical blow. At the bank, Mr. Garrett's face went pale when Clara placed the money on his desk. "Where did you get this?" "That's none of your concern. Here's the full amount owed, plus interest. I want the deed and a receipt." He clearly wanted to refuse, but with Will looming behind her and the law on her side, he had no choice. With obvious reluctance, he counted the money, prepared the paperwork, and handed over the deed to the property. "This doesn't change anything," he said coldly. "The community knows what kind of woman you are." "The community knows nothing," Clara replied, her voice steady despite her inner trembling. "But they're about to learn what kind of woman I am when pushed." Outside the bank, Clara clutched the deed, hardly believing it was real. The land was hers, free and clear. Thomas's final gift had saved them, but their victory was short-lived. As they prepared to mount their horses, Sheriff Watson approached, his expression apologetic but firm. "Will Camden, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." "On what charge?" Will demanded. "Vagrancy, for starters, disturbing the peace, whatever else the town council wants to add." The sheriff looked genuinely regretful. "I'm sorry, but I've got my orders." "This is ridiculous," Clara protested. "He's done nothing wrong." "Maybe not, ma'am, but the law's the law. He comes with me now, or things get ugly." Will studied the sheriff, then the gathering crowd. Clara could see him calculating odds, considering resistance. Then his shoulders relaxed. "All right, Sheriff. No need for trouble." "Will, no!" Clara grabbed his arm. He covered her hand with his. "It's okay. They can't hold me on these charges. Day or two at most." He leaned closer, speaking for her ears alone. "Go home. Bar the door. Don't let anyone in but me." "I won't let them do this," she said fiercely. "Yes, you will. Because you're smart, and we need to play this carefully." He squeezed her hand once more, then stepped away. "Go home. Clara, I'll come back to you. I promise." She watched helplessly as the sheriff led Will away, the townspeople's satisfied murmurs following them. Alone on the street, Deed in hand, but heartbreaking. Clara had never felt more isolated, but as she rode home through the gathering dusk, Thomas's letter pressed against her heart. She felt a new determination rising. They wanted to break her, they wanted to drive her out. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She was Clara Whitmore. She had survived the death of her husband and child. She had survived months of soul-crushing grief. She had found love again against all odds. And she would survive this too. More than survive. She would fight for her land, for Will, for the right to live and love as she chose. The town had made its position clear. Now it was her turn to make hers. The house stood dark and empty when she arrived, but it was hers, bought with sacrifice and love and Thomas's foresight. She lit every lamp she owned, letting light blaze from the windows like a beacon. Let them see. Let them know she wasn't hiding, wasn't ashamed, wasn't going anywhere. Tomorrow she would go to the county seat, find that lawyer, fight these trumped-up charges against Will. But tonight, she would stand guard over what was hers and plan her next move. The town wanted war. They would have it. The county seat was a day's hard ride, but Clara made it in just over 10 hours, pushing her horse through snow-covered trails with desperate determination. She'd left before dawn, ignoring the small crowd of townspeople who'd gathered to watch her property, no doubt hoping for some sign of scandal or surrender. She'd given them neither, simply saddling her horse and riding out with her chin high and Thomas's Colt .45 visible at her hip. Judge Cornelius McKenna was not what she'd expected, rather than the stern, imposing figure she'd imagined. He was a small man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers, who listened to her story without interruption. So, they've arrested Mr. Camden on charges of vagrancy, despite his having gainful employment repairing your property. He made notes as he spoke. And they moved up your mortgage deadline after learning of his presence in your home. Yes, Your Honor, they're trying to run us out of town for moral reasons. For perceived impropriety, the judge corrected gently. Mrs. Whitmore, what exactly is your relationship with Mr. Camden? Clara met his eyes directly. He's the man I intend to marry, Your Honor, when he's free and we can do things properly. I see. The judge leaned back in his chair. The charges against Mr. Camden are clearly spurious. I'll write an order for his immediate release. But Mrs. Whitmore, you must understand, I can compel legal action, but I cannot change hearts and minds. Your community has made its judgment. I understand, Your Honor, but it's my home. My husband is buried there. My child. I won't be driven away by narrow-minded gossip. Judge McKenna studied her for a long moment. You're a brave woman, Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps braver than wise, but courage should be rewarded, not punished. He began writing rapidly. This order will secure Mr. Camden's release. I'm also going to write a letter to Reverend Hopkins reminding him that moral authority does not supersede legal authority. Whether it will do any good? He shrugged eloquently. Clara rode through the night to get back, the judge's papers tucked safely in her coat. She arrived at the town jail just as Sheriff Watson was opening up for the morning. Mrs. Whitmore. He looked uncomfortable. Visiting hours aren't... I'm not here to visit. She handed him the judge's order. I'm here to collect Will Camden. Judge McKenna orders his immediate release. The sheriff read the papers slowly, his frown deepening. This is highly irregular. What's irregular is arresting a man for fixing a widow's roof. Clara shot back. Release him now. With clear reluctance, Sheriff Watson unlocked the cell. Will emerged looking rumpled but unbroken, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. Clara, you shouldn't have... Hush, she said, fighting the urge to throw herself into his arms. We'll talk outside. But outside, they found Reverend Hopkins waiting with a delegation of church elders and prominent townspeople. The minister's face was thunderous. This changes nothing, he announced. You may have used legal trickery to free your companion, but the moral stance of this community remains clear. You are no longer welcome in God's house. Mrs. Whitmore, nor in any establishment that values Christian virtue. Clara felt Will tense beside her, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Reverend Hopkins," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "Let me make sure I understand. You're barring me from church because I accepted help from a good man? Because I refuse to lose my home? Because I dare to hope for happiness after tragedy? Because you've chosen to live in sin," Deacon Bradley interjected, "flaunting your shame before the entire community. The only shame here is yours." Clara replied, "You speak of Christian virtue while showing none of Christ's compassion. You preach about charity while trying to steal my home. You claim moral authority while practicing cruelty." "How dare you?" Reverend Hopkins began. "I dare because I've already lost everything once." Clara interrupted. "My husband, my baby boy, nearly my sanity. I survived that, and I'll survive your petty judgments. But I wonder, when you stand before God, will you be proud to say you kicked a widow when she was down? Will you boast about trying to destroy the small happiness she found?" "Blasphemy," someone muttered. "Truth," Clara countered. "And here's another truth. Will Camden and I have done nothing wrong. He's been nothing but honorable, kind, and decent. More than I can say for those who've appointed themselves my judges." She turned to Will, making her decision in that moment. "Mr. Camden, I have a proposition for you. In front of all these witnesses, I'm asking, will you marry me today? Judge McKenna is still at the courthouse. We can be wed within the hour." Will's eyes widened, then softened with understanding and something deeper. "Mrs. Whitmore, nothing would make me happier. But are you sure? This isn't how—" "I'm sure," she said firmly. "Unless you'd prefer a church wedding?" She gestured to the glowering minister. "I'm sure Reverend Hopkins would be delighted to officiate." "The courthouse sounds perfect," Will said, taking her hand. "Lead the way." As they walked away, Clara heard the explosion of outraged voices behind them but didn't look back. At the courthouse, Judge McKenna seemed unsurprised to see them again. "Changed your mind about waiting to do things properly?" he asked with a slight smile. "We decided proper is relative," Clara replied. "Will you marry us, Your Honor?" "It would be my pleasure." "Do you have witnesses?" Clara's heart sank. They'd need witnesses for it to be legal. But then Sheriff Watson stepped through the door, looking conflicted but determined. "I'll stand witness," he said gruffly. "Known Will Camden to be a decent man, and Mrs. Whitmore. Your Thomas was a friend. He wouldn't want you persecuted for finding happiness again." The courthouse clerk, a widow herself, volunteered to be the second witness. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When Judge McKenna pronounced them husband and wife, Clara felt something shift inside her, not the giddy joy she'd experienced as a young bride, but a deep, settled rightness. "Well, Mrs. Camden," Will said softly. "What now?" "Now we go home," she said. "To our home." The ride back to the homestead was quiet, both of them absorbing the magnitude of what they'd done, married, in defiance of the town, in defense of their right to choose their own path. As they approached the property, Clara saw immediately that they'd had visitors. Someone had painted Jezebel across the barn wall in large, dripping letters. Several fence posts had been knocked down, but the house stood intact, and that was what mattered. "I'll repaint the barn," Will said mildly. "Maybe something more cheerful than red." Clara laughed, surprising herself. "Blue. I've always wanted a blue barn." Inside, they stood awkwardly in the kitchen, the reality of their sudden marriage settling over them. "Clara," Will began, "I want you to know, just because we're married doesn't mean I expect, that is, we can take things slowly." She moved closer to him, placing her hands on his chest. "Will Camden, we've done everything backwards from the start. Why change now?" She smiled up at him. "Besides, I've already compromised my reputation thoroughly. Might as well enjoy it." He laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Mrs. Camden, you are a constant surprise, Good. I'd hate to be predictable. She rose up on her toes to kiss him. Now, husband, I believe you mentioned something about a blue barn, but the barn would have to wait. Over the next weeks, the town's ostracism became complete. No one would sell to them at the general store. The bank refused to handle their money. Even the post office claimed to lose their mail. But Clara had expected this. What she hadn't expected was the support that began trickling in from unexpected sources. First came Maria Santos, whose husband worked at the Rodriguez ranch. She appeared one morning with a basket of eggs and freshly baked bread. My Miguel says Mr. Will helped him fix his wagon last month. Wouldn't take payment. We remember kindness. Then old Samuel Grayson, Thomas's friend from the early days, began leaving supplies on their porch at night: flour, coffee, ammunition. He never spoke to them directly, but the gifts continued. Most surprising was the widow Harrison, who'd lost her own husband 2 years prior. She arrived in broad daylight, uncaring of who saw her. Clara Camden, she announced. I've been where you are. Grief is a terrible companion. I'm glad you found a better one. She stayed for tea, bringing news from town and a promise to return. Slowly, quietly. A different community began forming around them. The outcasts, the marginalized, those who understood that sometimes survival meant breaking rules. Will found work at the outlying ranches, places that cared more about his skill with horses than his marriage choices. Clara began taking in mending and washing from the Mexican families who weren't welcome at the town laundry. One evening, as Clara stirred a pot of stew made from vegetables Maria had brought and beef mister, Grayson had left. She realized something profound. They weren't just surviving. They were building something new, a life outside the narrow confines of town prejudice, a home that welcomed all who came in peace. Penny for your thoughts, Will said, coming up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. I was thinking about walls, she said, how the town tried to build them around us. But instead, we've built our own, better ones. Stronger ones, he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. Built on something real. She turned in his arms, studying the face that had become so dear to her. The lines around his eyes had softened since their marriage, the wariness replaced by contentment. Do you regret it? The way things happened? Not for a moment, he said firmly. I found you, Clara, found home. The rest is just noise. A knock at the door interrupted them. Will reached for his rifle. They'd learned to be cautious, but Clara recognized the tentative pattern. It's Mrs. Harrison. But when she opened the door, it wasn't just the widow Harrison. Behind her stood 3 other women, all looking nervous but determined. Clara, Mrs. Harrison said, we've been talking. What's happening to you isn't right. We want to help, if you'll let us. And so it grew. The church might have cast her out, but Clara Camden was building her own congregation, one founded on acceptance rather than judgment, kindness rather than condemnation. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but as she looked around her kitchen at the women sharing coffee and conversation, at Will smiling from the doorway, she knew it was the life she was meant to have. The town had tried to break her. Instead, they'd helped her discover just how strong she could be. And in Will Camden, she'd found not just a husband but a partner in creating something new from the ashes of the old. Outside, the first hints of spring touched the air. Soon it would be time to plant the garden, to bring new life from the soil that had seen so much death. Clara thought Thomas would approve. After all, he'd always said life was for living, and finally, truly, she was. Spring arrived with a profusion of wildflowers that painted the prairie in yellows and purples, as if the earth itself was celebrating new beginnings. Clara stood in her garden, hands pressed to her lower back, watching Will repair the fence that separated their vegetables from the open range. The morning sun caught in his hair, and she felt that familiar warmth bloom in her chest. No longer the desperate heat of new love, but something deeper, more enduring. She'd suspected for weeks, but this morning had brought confirmation. The nausea, the tenderness, the bone-deep exhaustion that felt different from simple tiredness. She was carrying Will's child, The knowledge sat within her like a secret sun, warming and terrifying in equal measure. After losing Samuel, the thought of another pregnancy filled her with joy shadowed by fear. But this was different. This child had been conceived in love, not just hope. This child would have Will's steady presence, his protective strength. "You're looking thoughtful," Will said, having approached without her noticing. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, hands coming to rest on her still flat stomach in a gesture that made her wonder if he somehow knew. "Spring makes me thoughtful," she said, leaning back against him. "All this new life, pushing up through ground that seemed dead all winter." "Speaking of new life," he said, "Maria Santos says her cousin Rosa needs work. Lost her husband last month, has 2 little ones to feed. I thought maybe she could help with the laundry business." Clara smiled. Their home had become a refuge for the displaced, the widowed, the ostracized. The laundry business she'd started had grown beyond their small cabin, with Mexican and Apache women coming to work, sharing the labor and the profits. The town ladies might refuse to acknowledge her existence, but their husbands still needed clean shirts, and Clara's service was the only one that would deal with the ranch hands and travelers. "We'll need the help," she said carefully, "especially in a few months." Will stilled against her. "Clara, are you saying—" She turned in his arms, seeing the hope dawning in his eyes. "Come autumn, you'll be a father." The joy that transformed his face was worth every moment of uncertainty. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around before setting her down gently, as if she were made of spun glass. "A baby," he breathed. "Our baby." "Our baby," she confirmed, laughing at his wonder. "Though I'd appreciate if you didn't mention it yet, not until I'm further along, not until I'm sure." "Of course." He cupped her face, thumbs stroking her cheeks. "Whatever you need. Clara, I never thought I'd have this chance again." "Neither did I," she admitted. "I'm terrified." "Me too," he said. "But we'll face it together, like everything else." The news of her pregnancy spread despite their attempts at discretion. In a small community, some changes were impossible to hide. The women who'd become their allies, Maria, Mrs. Harrison, Rosa, and others, surrounded Clara with quiet support, sharing remedies for morning sickness and stories of their own pregnancies. But the town's reaction was predictably harsh. Reverend Hopkins delivered a sermon about the fruits of sin, heavily implying that any child born to their union would be marked by their transgression. Several of the more vindictive townspeople made sure Clara heard their predictions of divine punishment. The worst came on a market day in early summer. Clara had ventured into town with Mrs. Harrison, needing supplies the traveling merchants wouldn't bring to outlying homesteads. She was examining fabric for baby clothes when Amelia Bradley, the deacon's wife, approached. "How dare you show your face here?" Amelia hissed. "Parading your shame for all to see. The only shame here is yours." "Mrs." Harrison retorted, but Clara placed a calming hand on her friend's arm. "Mrs. Bradley?" Clara said evenly. "I'm shopping for my child. If that offends you, I suggest you shop elsewhere." "You're bastard, you mean." Amelia spat. "Born of sin and adultery." "My child is legitimate," Clara replied, her hand moving protectively to her growing belly. "Born to married parents who love each other. Can you say the same about the spirit of your words?" Amelia's face flushed ugly red. "You think your hasty marriage sanctifies your sin? You were carrying on with that drifter while your husband's grave was still fresh." The accusation hung in the air, drawing stares from other shoppers. Clara felt the old shame trying to rise, but then she thought of Will's love, of the life growing within her, of the community they'd built from society's cast-offs. "My husband has been dead over a year," she said clearly, letting her voice carry. "I mourned him deeply and truly, but Thomas wouldn't want me to bury myself with him. He'd want me to live, to love, to bring new life into the world. That's what I'm doing." She turned to the merchant, who'd been watching nervously. "I'll take 3 yards of the yellow calico, please, and 2 of the white cotton." as he cut the fabric with shaking hands. Clara heard whispers rippling through the store, some condemning, but others held a note of admiration, even envy. How many of these women were trapped in loveless marriages, bound by duty and convention? How many wished they had Clara's courage to choose love over approval? The confrontation marked a turning point. While the town's official stance remained unchanged, cracks began to show. A few more women began quietly buying Clara's laundry services. The doctor, while publicly maintaining his distance, sent word through Mrs. Harrison that he'd attend the birth if needed. Even Sheriff Watson, while careful to avoid open association, had been known to chase off young troublemakers who came to harass their homestead. As summer ripened toward autumn, Clara's pregnancy progressed smoothly despite her fears. Will was tender and attentive, often talking to her belly in the evenings, telling the baby stories about the ranch where he'd grown up, the horses he'd trained, the adventures he'd had. Clara would lie with her head in his lap, fingers in his hair, feeling complete in a way she'd never imagined possible after her losses. The morning glory vines she'd planted climbed the new blue barn, blooming in defiance of their painful associations. She could think of Samuel now without the crushing weight of grief, could remember his laughter without feeling like she was drowning. The baby she carried wouldn't replace him. Nothing could, but it represented hope, future, the possibility of joy after sorrow. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Clara felt the baby move strongly. She grabbed Will's hand, placing it where the movement was strongest. "There," she said. "Feel that?" His face lit up with wonder as the baby kicked against his palm. "Strong little thing. Like his mama. Or her mama," Clara corrected with a smile. "Or her." He leaned down to kiss her belly, then her lips. Either way, this child will know they're loved. Will know they're wanted. Will never doubt they belong. Clara thought of the town's rejection, the painted slurs that still ghosted the barn wall despite repeated whitewashing, the way certain people cross the street rather than pass her. They'll face challenges. Being our child won't be easy in this place. Then maybe this place needs to change, Will said. Or maybe we build something better. We've already started, haven't we? Our own community, our own family. It was true. Their Sunday gatherings had become legendary among the ranchers and outcasts. While the town gathered in the church that had rejected them, Clara and Will hosted anyone who cared to come. Mexican vaqueros, Apache traders, widows and spinsters, traveling merchants of questionable reputation, all were welcome at the Camden table. They sang songs in 3 languages, shared stories and food, created their own sacred space defined by inclusion rather than exclusion. 3 weeks before Clara's due date, she woke to familiar pains. Terror seized her. It was too early, too much like before. But Will was there, calm and steady, sending for the doctor and Maria, who delivered dozens of babies. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and as dawn broke over the prairie, their daughter entered the world with a cry that sounded like triumph. "She's perfect," Will breathed, cradling the tiny bundle with infinite care. "Look at her, Clara. She's absolutely perfect." Clara, exhausted but euphoric, traced the baby's features. Will's nose, her mouth, a cap of dark hair that could have belonged to either of them. What should we call her? They'd discussed names for months, but looking at their daughter, only one seemed right. Hope. Clara said, "Hope, Sarah Camden?" Will's eyes glistened. "After Sarah? She was part of your journey to me." Clara said simply, "Part of what made you who you are. She should be remembered." The baby, Hope, opened her eyes, seeming to look directly at them with that unfocused intensity of newborns. In that moment, Clara felt the last of her old life fall away. She wasn't Thomas's widow anymore, or the woman who'd lost everything. She was Clara Camden, mother and wife, builder of sanctuaries and defender of the rejected. She'd been refined by fire and come out stronger. Word of Hope's birth spread quickly. The first visitors were their adopted family, Maria and her children, Mrs. Harrison, Rosa, the vaqueros who'd become Will's friends. They brought gifts both practical and precious, hand-sewn blankets, carved toys, blessings in multiple languages. What Clara didn't expect was the knock that came 3 days later. She opened the door to find Reverend Hopkins standing on her porch, hat in hand, looking older and somehow diminished. "Mrs. Camden," he said stiffly, "I heard you'd been safely delivered of a daughter." "I have," she said, making no move to invite him in. He shifted uncomfortably. "I've come to... That is, the church feels, despite past differences, a child is innocent of its parents' choices. We'd be willing to perform a baptism." Clara studied him for a long moment. She could see what this cost him, this small overture. But she also saw its limitations. They'd baptize hope but still shun her parents. They'd offer conditional acceptance to an infant while maintaining their judgment of the adults. "Thank you for the offer," she said finally. "But Hope will be baptized among people who accept her fully, parents and all. Good day, Reverend." She closed the door on his shocked face, feeling no triumph, only a quiet certainty. They'd chosen their path. There was no going back, and she didn't want to. That Sunday, they held Hope's naming ceremony by the creek, with Judge McKenna officiating and their eclectic congregation serving as witnesses. The baby slept through most of it, waking only when the judge sprinkled water on her head, her cry mingling with the laughter of the assembled crowd. Afterward, as people shared food and stories and music, Clara stood with Will watching their daughter be passed from arm to arm, each person offering blessings in their own way. This was their church, messy and imperfect but real. This was their family, chosen and cherished. "Any regrets?" Will asked, echoing his question from months ago. Clara looked at Hope sleeping in Maria's arms, at Mrs. Harrison teaching Rosa's children a clapping game, at the vaqueros sharing whiskey with the traveling merchant, at the life they'd built from the ashes of conformity. "None," she said, meaning it completely. "Not one." Will wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close as the sun set over their unconventional kingdom. They'd started with a leaking roof and 2 broken hearts. They'd built something extraordinary, not just a repaired house, but a home for all who needed one. Not just a marriage, but a partnership that challenged the narrow boundaries of their world. In the growing dusk, the first stars appeared, and Clara made a wish on them, not for easier times, but for the strength to meet whatever came next. With Will beside her and Hope in their arms, she knew they could weather any storm. The whispers might never stop. The town might never fully accept them, but here on the margins, they'd discovered something better than acceptance. They'd found freedom. Freedom to love, to choose, to build the life they wanted rather than the one prescribed for them. And as the prairie wind carried the sounds of laughter and music across the darkening land, Clara Camden knew with bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Not the life she'd planned, but the one she'd fought for. Not the easy path, but the right one. She was home. Thank you for listening to this story. If you're enjoying Tales from the Wild West, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps bring these frontier stories to life. Until next time, partners.